American people. They didn't want to live there, so they went out to the suburbs. That's what creates the great American suburb. We go from that to the Eisenhower's nuclear family, and that's what, it is American apple pie. My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right, welcome back to another episode of How Did That Happen? HDTH. This week we're going to talk about apartheid. I'm going to try to get into the nitty gritty of what apartheid is, and I'm also going to give you a quick history of South Africa. But before we get into all of that, we got the normal housekeeping that comes with this this podcast. It's always 7 days a week. You can find out how things happen if you head over to hdthappen.com. There you will find episode transcripts as well as pictures and videos for every episode. There's also a blog on there with articles that are written by yours truly. I actually haven't written one in a little while, but I'm kind of getting some ones in my brain that I want to put out. And so I'm definitely going to try to get back to that. As always, what am I watching? I mentioned it on the Bite-Sized Bios recently, but I'm watching The Last of Us. I'm waiting for that new episode to come out tomorrow. It's a really good show, and it's more than anything. I think it's showing it's making people think about the idea of binge watching, as opposed to, weekly episodic, kind of offerings. And I think I like this like that because it allows, granted, everyone can still go at their own speeds and different stuff like that, but it does kind of dictate the speed at which you watch it. We're all waiting now for the 4th episode. We're all going to see what happens in the next episode. That kind of takes you back a little bit, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't know what it is, it's basically there's a pandemic, which makes it kind of hit close to home. If anybody who's been alive in the last few years, there's a pandemic that is kind of making these zombie type things that are coming from mushrooms, and the mushrooms are getting in their bodies and kind of taking over their brains, and they want to do that to other people as well. And so it's kind of after that, but also in that they're kind of bouncing around at different times. Pretty good show. Like I said, I just watched another show called You Don't Know Me on Netflix. And if you follow this podcast, and you've probably heard me talk about how much I love British crime dramas, well, I found another one. And this one has a brilliant story and is also told in a very interesting way that I've never kind of seen before. It's told from the perspective of a man who was on trial for murder in the UK. And right before he is to be sentenced, he is allowed to address the jury one final time and kind of tell them his side of the story. And he basically takes all the evidence that is against him and kind of flips it and shows you why he's actually innocent. And it's a 4-episode show. I watched the whole thing like in a row. Didn't even expect to. Just kind of sat down. I had 4 hours to kill it, but I watched the whole thing. I'm telling you, it's good. It is. If you like storytelling, if you like different types of storytelling, if you like a good whodunit, like yours truly here, you will enjoy it. I'm telling you, you're in for a good time. What am I listening to? I'm listening to The Blocks with Neil Brennan. He's a comedian, and it's a new pod. It's a good pod though. It plays off of his Netflix special he just put out, which is called Blocks, and it's like he breaks down the different parts of his life into blocks, like anxiety or addiction or fear, and he talks to people about them, different celebrities and comedians. His first episode, I believe, is David Letterman. So if you're wondering, it's a new pod, but he's very famous. He was actually the co-creator of Chappelle's Show. So if you wonder where you've seen him from, he has a good stand-up out there that's called Three Mics, which is very innovative. Where he has 3 different mics that have 3 different emotions, and he tells different stories at every mic. It's also on Netflix. But yeah, The Blocks is good. I also listened to This Past Weekend with Theo Von. I've listened to that for a while. I love Theo Von. He's a very unique personality. He used to be back in that whole Road Rules, like real world kind of crew. He's a very unique dude, which is why I like just to hear him say things. It's worth it to me. He interviews a lot of people, not just comedians, but yeah, it's called This Past Weekend. And as always, if I plug those podcasts, I can plug my own mini-sode for this podcast, and that is Bite-Sized Bios, BSB. The most recent one is out now. We profile Gandhi, and we find out a lot about him. We talk about his ups as well as his downs, and that's what I'm trying to do a little bit more in this podcast as we grow a little bit, is to cover all sides of these people that we talk about, all sides of these topics that we talk about, and try to get into some things that maybe I didn't quite get into in the first year. I was trying to lay a basis for things, but we talk about his hunger strikes in addition to his celibacy experiments, which go off the rails. But go and check that out. It comes out every Thursday at 4:30 a.m. As always, like and subscribe wherever you are hearing this. It really helps the pod grow. If you want to give us 5 stars, that is awesome. But if you want to give us 2 stars and tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars, that's fine too. Constructive criticism is always welcome. I don't know if there's anything else really to say before we get to the pod. Thank you guys for pressing play all the time. I really do appreciate it. I really do. Cannot believe we're in year 2 of this podcast. Cannot believe we're even in month 2 of year 2 of this podcast. It really does make me happy. It makes me see where this podcast could go, because I've seen where it's been. Not to be cliche, but I mean, I don't know. When I started it, I never really thought fully about where it was going to go. If you'd asked me over a year ago if I thought I'd still be doing it, I probably would have said no. Or I don't know. But it is something that I come back for week to week, and I see some of you guys coming back for week to week, and I always appreciate that. But yeah, so without further ado, as we're known to do, here is the episode. All right, so today we're going to talk about apartheid, right? But as is normal for this podcast, we need to go back and look at the history of South Africa as a whole, and then fit apartheid into its place within the overall history of this country. We'll see that modern humans have lived in South Africa for almost 200,000 years, but the ancestors of humans have lived in that area for at least probably 3 million years, give or take. And there's even a place called, I believe it is Meropang, which is considered to be like the cradle of civilization. I know we talked about there's multiple cradle of civilizations throughout the world. There's also the Crescent, I believe, out in the Middle East, which is said to be one of the beginnings of humanity. But this is also they call this the cradle of civilization because it has like the largest amount of ancestral remains anywhere else in the world. So there's the largest amount of ancestral, like human ancestor body parts, basically, or fossils that they've ever found. So South Africa does play a large part in the world overall. Let's see a quick geographic layout, because people may not know. I just know it's at the bottom of Africa, which it is. It is at the very bottom, the very southernmost tip of Africa, but it is bordered by countries such as Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. There's even countries inside of South Africa, which is interesting. I always find that to be very interesting, because they're completely encompassed on all sides. This country, I heard how they pronounce it. I believe it's Lesotho, but it's spelled Lesotho. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I've done a lot of research and I can't remember how to pronounce this specific country, but it's really interesting how it's just inside of South Africa, but completely independent from South Africa. On either side of the country, there's the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. And they also have some islands off the coast of South Africa that are a part of South Africa. So now we'll get into the settlement history of South Africa, which to me, well, not even just to me, but this is really the basis and foundation for what would then become apartheid. So we did a quick recap of what South Africa is as far as like what it is overall, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into like their independence and stuff like that. But what we're going to talk about now is the first real European contact with this country or this territory or whatever it was during that time, and take that all the way through into when apartheid becomes what it is. Because I think South Africa has a very unique history. I didn't know anything about it before I did this. I started to do the apartheid because I was always just wondered how that works. I've read some books about some people, some South Africans, and it's always just seemed like such a complex system that I just wonder what are the roots of this? What made this be? Because you can look at American racism and the civil rights and slavery and stuff like that, and there's a reason why America is the way that it is, and it's because the way we were set up. It was our foundation. It was the fact that for 300 or 400 years, this country was built off the backs of slaves, free labor, and then when they were free, they were basically not treated that well by the people who had enslaved them. That is the history of America in a nutshell. But the same story cannot be said for South Africa. It had its own like history that surrounds like racism and Europeans and Africans mixing. I wanted to find out what created that. So we'll find the first European contact for South Africans, or the people that lived in that area, was from the Portuguese in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and they did not actually try to settle this area. They just used it as a resting point on their trip to India. They were always, because before because before the Suez Canal was built, that was the only way you could get from Europe to Asia, was to go around Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, which is essentially why this would also be just a very important part of the world regionally when you look at it, as we'll see over the next 500 years, for a number of reasons. But yeah, so the Portuguese were the first ones to do it. They did not try to settle. It was just a kind of a halfway point for them to kind of get some supplies and keep it moving. The first people that actually wanted to try to make something out of this area were the Dutch. And they arrived with the Dutch East India Company, which was a very, a large, just colonizing machine, as we'll see. Also, with the British Empire had their own version of this as well. But they established a resupply station at Cape Town around 1652. And this was also for the same reason that the Portuguese did it as well, so they could, kind of establish a middle kind of way between Holland and Southeast Asia. And pretty much from that point forward, they came into contact with the Bantu-speaking chiefdoms of the of Cape Town. Basically, this is when they first started to really collide with the natives of Africa. And we will see that these guys battled. They had multiple wars against each other over this time. But by 1795, the British occupied the Cape as a strategic base against the French. So this is when we kind of take a turn here, whereas initially the European powers were trying to hold this place really just to have, as a settlement, and also to have as a halfway point between, and I don't want to keep saying halfway point, I don't know if it's halfway point, but it's a stopping point between Europe and Asia, which allows you to kind of refuel and stuff like that. They went from doing that to kind of holding it as a military strategic base in like the European power structure. And that's what we'll see is actually what leads to Britain taking it over. When this happens, the Dutch don't really like this. They're not really into the British rule. I mean, they are themselves a separate European country, so they don't like when another European country comes in and says, this is how we're going to do stuff. And, Britain basically comes in and tries to take all of the resources. And this country, as we'll find, they say it's one of the most, it's just like jam-packed with natural resources, like more than like any other country or area. Like not just saying this is the best one, but there's a lot of diamonds, there's a lot of gold that they find out. There's an interesting fact that the largest diamond I believe ever found in the world was found in South Africa, and guess where the largest cutting of it rests right now? You have one guess. Yes, with the British royal family. It's in like some sort of scepter. I might put a picture of it on the website. Like it is just European colonization at its finest. But yeah, the biggest diamond in the world was found in South Africa, and it belongs now to the British. Back to what we're talking about. When the British took over, kind of Cape Town, because the Brits weren't big on going inland into South Africa. There really wasn't their shtick. They wanted to stay on the coast all around. They really only wanted to just they wanted to be able to have supplies for their ships, which, like I said, that was one of the largest reasons that Cape Town in South Africa gets settled as a whole. We find in the 1800s and in the 1700s. Another reason that the British actually really wanted to take over South Africa is they were trying to keep it out of French hands. They were trying to keep it away from Napoleon and everything that he was doing. So that's actually the main reason why Britain went after it, and they actually succeeded in taking it over as a colony. And this really is where we start to see the divide between even the European colonists that are in South Africa, because there is a difference in the way the Dutch want to do things and the way that the British want to do things. But so basically, you get these European farmers known as Boers, right? I believe that's how I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they're basically from like kind of Dutch and German heritage, maybe even a little bit of French in there. They're the ones they're the ones that go on to be called what are called the Afrikaners or Afrikaners. I'm not sure, but they're like basically the white contingency of South Africa. That's where they come from. They're the ones, like I said, didn't like the British rule, and they would actually end up going inland and creating the rest of South Africa. Yeah, so we get to the Great Trek, which was basically when all the Dutch-speaking settlers left the Cape Colony and just went inwards, which, like I said, wasn't that long after Britain kind of completely gained its full control of what was South Africa at the time. And the Great Trek was a result or a culmination of tensions between the rural descendants of the Cape's original European settlers, known as the Boers, the Dutch people, and the British Empire. They were just two types of white people that just could not get along. And it was also kind of, I guess, indicative of like the way the lifestyle that the Boers wanted to live. They wanted more of an isolationist, kind of semi-nomadic lifestyle, and you couldn't really do that with being fully controlled by their crown, by the British crown. Okay, and so now we'll get to where they kind of strike gold, and everybody's like, "Oh, this is more. This is important for a number of reasons. It was just a place we could all stop before we went to Asia. Now there's diamonds and gold here, but this is also another kind of thorn in the side of the Afrikaners, the Boers, the Dutch people, because the Brits kind of want to take control over everything. Because obviously they do. They run the colony, so they're getting the biggest, the largest cut of anything that comes out of the Earth right now during that time. And this is also where we start to see, the mistreatment of the native Africans that are even just doing regular work. Maybe they're getting paid for what they're doing, but not paid very well to kind of mine in these mines and pull up all these diamonds and gold and different things. Or even on farms. That's where we see. That's where you start to see the divide kind of expand between the cultures. Is just kind of almost in the same way as it is in America, or as it was in America during the slavery time, but not quite, because there's a little bit more of it's like these guys can work, but they don't get good rights. So they're a little bit ahead of America in that respect. But it's like that's what makes them mad. It makes them want to have the rights of their colonizers. And the way they kind of did this was what the British would do was they would basically just take over all of these independent African states that had not become a part of South Africa yet, but had mines in them. And so the British would come in and would take it, and then basically make them the Africans are already working in the mines, but now that they've taken over that area, now it's British control. Now everything comes, everything, a portion goes to the crown, and so the people now have to continue to work, do what they were doing, but now they have no control over the amount of money that they're making, because they're now being controlled by the Brits, the Brits, and not just themselves. It's really kind of a interesting scheme that they probably ran all over the world when you look at it. And so in these new cities that they will pop up around these mines, because it's just like those gold towns in America. You need a town for the people that are doing all this gold mining to have when they leave the mines. The African workers were subjected to a bunch of different discriminatory laws and practices, and this is where we start to see like the basis for where apartheid will come in. Apartheid is going to come in. I think right now we're about 1870, give or take, in our timeline. Apartheid will show up in about 75 years as an actual law. But this is where we begin, almost in the sense of like Jim Crow when you relate it back to America. It's where like it's kind of a wink and a nod as to like your place in society. You know what you should and should not say, and where you should and should not be. Or even like we covered in our most recent episode of Bite Size Bios with Gandhi, how they couldn't even walk. Indian people couldn't even walk on the sidewalks in Johannesburg in the late 1800s. You know what I mean? Like it's so like it's, but there wasn't really a law. There wasn't apartheid yet, because he was actually gone from South Africa by the time apartheid even became a law. But it was, like I said, that wink and a nod of like, what you should be doing, and it's not that. And so this, like I said, the cities that pop up around these mines is what kind of starts the discriminatory laws to be put into place. It's not just this. This isn't the whole thing. This isn't like the impetus, if you will. It's really not that. This is kind of the culmination of a couple hundred years of always kind of being treated as like third-class citizens, if you will. If you look at it in the hierarchy, you have the Brits, then you have the Dutch, then you have anybody else who's around, which is brown, and then they break that down even more. I don't know if we'll get to it, so I'll lay it out here. I believe how it works is they have like in the apartheid system, they have the whites, they have the blacks, they have the coloreds, and then they have the Indians. So it's broken down into 4 different types of racial backgrounds, basically. And so coloreds are actually people who are of any kind of mixed descent, and blacks are just like the actual native African American people there. White people are any kind of European person who have come from Europe, and then the Indians, who actually came by way of the settling the British East India Empire, the British East India Company, basically because they kind of colonized India. We see a large amount of Indians who end up kind of migrating to South Africa once again. To go back to our last bio of Gandhi, he also did the same thing and spent 20 years in South Africa during the early 20th century. But let's get back to the 1880s-ish, because what I find, and I didn't realize, that there were a number of wars, like I told you earlier, that these guys fought between the British and like the Dutch. They're called the Boer Wars. Not pretty cool. You don't want to say wars are cool, but they fought a number of times. Like I said, the first one that they did, I believe, was in the 1890s. And this was all over the, it was because like the Boers, I believe, that I won't, put words in their mouth, but I feel like they felt entitled to more ownership and profits of what was being taken from the land, because like it used to be theirs and they still live there. And Britain was just like, nah, bruh, that's all the crown right there. And so because of that, they would fight these Boer Wars, and a lot of people would die. A lot of people would die. And what's interesting about this in the Boer Wars is because what the British did to the people of that country, of that area, and not even always specifically the Boers, but even like the black people, the natives, they put them in concentration camps. And that's interesting when you think about the fact that it would be maybe 20 or 30 years later when the West would be fighting against the use of concentration camps in World War II. But when you look at it, because they said I think something like 27,000 people died in those concentration camps in the Boer Wars. This was all instituted by the Brits. This was all done by the British Crown. And so when you think about it, it's nobody's hands are clean, I guess, is what you find when you do all this research. I was very surprised to find out. Because they make it seem so barbaric and crazy when they talk about Hitler, and what he did, and when the troops found Auschwitz, and because it is horrific, right? But you have to realize that it's been done so many times before, and so you can't. To me, I can't parse it out. I can't make it different. When I read this and find out that the British created concentration camps that killed almost 30,000 people in a war. I mean, yeah, it's not 6 million Jews, but it's like, it's definitely the same thought process in my head. So, but that was just a little side about the Boer Wars. Now we're getting into the actual 20th century of South Africa, and we'll see that the Union of South Africa was established on May 31st, 1910 as a self-governing state within the British Empire, which that's the road that colonies go. If you look at it within, the British Empire, they go from being a colony to being just a part of the Commonwealth, and then some of them even want after that to be established as independent nations. So that hasn't happened yet for them in 1910, but they are a self-governing state. And even when this happened, the legislation that was drawn up restricted property rights and political rights to only be of use for whites. It wasn't the most black communities did not have the ability to own property or participate in political proceedings. There were one or two who would end up being in there, in as far as like in politics, but during that time, but there was not many. And then there was the Mines and Works Act of 1911, which basically said that only whites were permitted to hold skilled jobs in the mining industry. So they're literally making laws that are restricting people from even having the ability to have a good job. They're just saying this is not even a possibility for you. It's not even about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. We're saying legally you cannot do this job. And then you get the Natives Land Act of 1913, and that prohibits the Native Africans from owning land in any part of South Africa outside of a small area that the government set aside for their use. It was about, I think, 7% of the entire country, and got to be about 13% at its largest before we get into the whole changing of who could live where. And I'm telling you this because this is what lays the groundwork for a disenfranchised people who end up being just classified into a section of society that has no rights. You wonder how it happens. It happens slowly. It's the same way when you do look at the Jews in World War II. I mean, they slowly made it so that it was illegal to be Jewish, and that's almost what you see here with apartheid. Is like when you look at World War II, they boycotted Jewish businesses. They said that Jewish businesses couldn't sell. I believe it was on certain days, or they weren't allowed to be open. So it's like you're just stopping people from even trying to have any little bit of commerce, and you're just making them, like I said, you're taking their civil rights from them one bit at a time. And that's what you see from here. I mean, from the you can't work in the mines, so you can't own property. I mean, they're literally making laws that are stopping the people that live in this country from just living in this country. So by doing so, these laws ensured that Africans would have to seek jobs from their white employers, and that their jobs would be the lowest paid jobs available. And without the right to vote, they couldn't change these laws. So you see yourself, this is what I mean when I'm trying to really explain the basis for how we get to apartheid, the catch-22 that the brown people in this country found themselves in. It's that, they've already made the laws that make it so you can't have good jobs and you can't participate politically, so you can't change your situation. That's why it is so important in democratic societies to vote. When you think about it, not going to get on that soapbox, but you think about people who literally just didn't have the right. You just don't even have a say in how your life goes. It's kind of scary when you think about it. And so once this happens, after it becomes the Union of South Africa, we do see that the political landscape breaks into two different types, two different parties. You get the Afrikaner nationalist movement, which is basically all of the previous Dutch settlers, and then you get the African National Congress, which formed in 1912, and that was made to try to give the black people in that area just some bit of a voice. It was very small when it first started, but it would actually go on to be the party of Nelson Mandela, and I believe it is still around right now. And the current president, I believe, is also a member of the African National Congress. So it eventually grew some legs, and that will bring us to the beginnings of apartheid, what we all came here for, what we've all been waiting for. Now we've laid the groundwork for this by telling you everything not everything, a lot of about South African history, which I think you can. Like I said, you can't jump into apartheid. You couldn't jump into the history of America or the history of slavery in America without talking about America. The same way you can't jump into apartheid without talking about the history of South Africa. So we've done that. Now on to the juicy stuff, if you will. So throughout the 20s, 30s, and the 40s, the Afrikaner nationalist movement grew in popularity. It was fueled by fears of black competition for jobs, the memory of their past suffering, which these guys they lost those Boer Wars. That's why they weren't able to actually separate themselves from the Brits until the Brits kind of let them do it. So they were kind of sad about that, and just watching the world change, I think, and seeing themselves on the smaller side of it. So in 1948, with the support of a majority of the Afrikaners, which was a lot of them, they won re-election with apartheid as part of their platform. And so because of that, South Africa was governed by a party that hoped to shape government policies and work in favor of whites in general, and the Afrikaners, them in particular. And with this, they also described and denied the Africans, Asians, or anybody else who's colored they said they could never be a citizen or have full participation in the South African political process. So this just gets keeping nailing that home of like, you were a second-class citizen if you're anything, and you're barely that. And so apartheid is basically Afrikaner for apartness, which is Afrikaner is a evolution of Dutch. So you get that. And so apartheid means apartness. And it was a system of legislation that upheld segregation against non-white citizens in South Africa. And that's just a small definition of what apartheid is. And so once the National Party, which was just part of the Afrikaner nationalist movement, they gained power in 1948, they basically began enforcing all these existing policies of racial segregation. They started to basically make apartheid, it was real. Like I said before that, it was just a kind of a wink and a nod of like, how you should be. They start to put these little acts into place that say you can't own land, you can't work at this job. Now there are like legal legislation in place that says like, this is how our country operates. We are separated by race, and not even just by a little bit. Like in all facets of life, we are separated. And so under apartheid, the non-white South Africans, which was the majority of the population, they were forced to live in separate areas from whites and to use separate public facilities. On paper, it appeared to call for equal development and freedom of cultural expression, but the way it was implemented made this virtually impossible. And so this would actually remain in effect for the next 50 years and would stop in the 90s, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I'll explain to you just how apartheid works if you've never done any research on it, if you've never watched any movies on it. I mean, it is its own system. It is its own operating system, if you will. So under the laws of apartheid, every person, every resident in South Africa was legally assigned, like I said, based on their racial appearance. And so there was broken down into four groups. You had the white, you had the African, the black people, and you had the colored, who were mixed of any kind, and then you had the Asians, who were just any type of Asian. And so that was the four different types of classes that basically make up the apartheid system. So South Africa, under the NP, was proclaimed to be a white man's country, a white person's country, in which members of other racial groups would never receive full political rights. And their education was provided based on the roles that they were expected to play in society, which is even more what I'm saying about when you talk about the idea of they're making laws that say you can't work this job and you can't live here and you don't have a political voice at all. So, and they're not even giving you the tools to even get any better than that. They're not giving you the tools to learn how to get out of your situation. They're saying, so because we placed you in this box, here's all the education you'll ever need to live in this box. I hope you're happy there. You know, kind of it's a lot. It's different than the American system because I feel like there is that part of American society that is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There is always a way to kind of make a way, you know, to move up and level up as people say. But the way South African apartheid was instituted, they left no light at the end of the tunnel for these people. You know, they said you're gonna be born into this class of society. We're gonna educate you based on this class of society. You're gonna live where these people live, and that's where you'll die. It's actually very sad when you think about the entire trajectory of life because people lived and died in this lasted. When you think, I mean, it lasted for 50 years as actual law, but probably before that another 50 years it was basically law as well. So for 100 years apartheid was the way things worked. So people lived and died under this rule. Another instrumental act that was passed by the nationalist, the African Nationalist Party, was the Bantu Self-Government Act, which it was passed in 1959. And this basically said that the racial groups had to live in different areas, and they gave a small amount to the black people in South Africa to make their homelands. But what another large part of this act, what it did was it got rid of all the black areas inside of white areas by moving all the black people outside of the city. So that, you know, we can walk through or drive through, like in certain parts of town and everywhere, you know, in America or whatever, you see, though, there's the black part of town, there's the white. No, they said, no, there's no black part of town here. The black people are outside of this town. And they put them all outside of a town or outside of any of the white towns in South Africa. And they were not allowed to own property there. They could only rent it from the white people that lived in those cities. And so it just shows you more like where there was no way out. You really couldn't even, I don't even think there'd be a room for a Martin Luther King Jr. in this place, because it's not about just saying the right things or saying we want freedom and you get it. It's like they're literally being just having all their rights taken from them by the government pretty much every year. I mean, when you think about how crazy is that to say, because you look the way you look, we're going to remove you from this entire town, this entire city, this entire metro area, put you on the outskirts, and no, you can never own land because of how you look, because of who you are. It's remarkable. And under this rule, not this one specifically, it was actually the Population Registration Act of 1950, which is what made, like I believe we said earlier, it broke all the people down into the different groups, the 4 different groups. And under this, you could not marry and you couldn't mix races with marriage. There was no intermingling of the races. But you would even find, and this is very interesting, and if you, I believe I mentioned it before with Trevor Noah's book. I believe it's called Born a Crime. I've read it. It's a very good book. And he's from South Africa, and he talks about, because he's mixed race, and so his father, I forget what country he's from in Europe. He's a white guy, and his mom was black, and so he would, like, literally, if he was walking out with his family, they would, like, legit act like they didn't know him, because all 3 of them were in separate racial groups. If you think about it, he's the perfect example of this. He lived in apartheid. Trevor Noah lived in apartheid, and his book talks about it. He talks about times where his mother would act like she didn't know him in public, because legally, if she did know him, it's illegal, because how do you know this mixed race kid? Is that your kid? So you had sex with a white person? That's illegal. You can't do that. So, like, she would have to run through all these different hoops, jump through all these hoops just to be able to live life. And he himself, growing up, and he talks about it's hard when there are times when your own mother, you know, kind of acts like she doesn't know you. And your dad, you have to walk behind your dad, because legally y'all can't walk beside each other because it's a crime. The title of his book is called Born a Crime. It's very good. I would check it out. But that's just, it is an everyday example of what apartheid was like. And we'll see that the Africans, once they're removed from society, they're kind of broken down into what are called Bantus, and every kind of black person in South Africa is given a Bantu. It's like a tribe, but not really a tribe. They're all classified as citizens within this, and this is supposed to actually give them, political rights. I'm using air quotes as I say this, but it really just, just removes them further from the actual machine that is South African politics. So it says here that from 1961 to 1994, which is when apartheid ends, actually officially ends, more than 3.5 million people were taken from their homes and deposited into these Bantu stands, where they were plunged into poverty and hopelessness. So basically, like I'm saying, they were just taken from their homes, wherever they were at, and put on these little camps and said, "This is your home now. This is where you live." And you don't get a choice. No one's asking you. It's all telling. So that'll probably bring us to the end of apartheid, and I wanted to talk about that because it's you wonder how it actually all of this can come to an end and how everybody can live in harmony. And that's the one thing that is different about American politics and racism and South African politics and racism is that South African politics and racism, they put theirs in the books. Americans did too, but in a different way, in a much different way. There are different things. It was much more. I don't want to say it wasn't a natural ebb and flow, but it was like when you look at things like what the white flight and the Great Migration. Those weren't instituted by legislation. They were instituted by people, be they both white or black, looking for a better life experience and thinking that they needed to do that by doing those things. And just quickly, if you don't know what those are, the white flight is when the white population of the metropolitan urban areas in the early 20th century left and went out to the suburbs because the metros were getting filled with a bunch of different immigrants and African American people. They didn't want to live there, so they went out to the suburbs. That's what creates the Great American Suburb. We go from that to the Eisenhower's nuclear family, and that's what it is American apple pie. And then you get the Great Migration. That's done by the black people that leave from the South and go up to the North in search of a better life, thinking that racist whites in Alabama got to be worse than the racist whites in Illinois. And that's the whole. But that's just happened because of what they thought. Whereas this was like in South Africa, they wrote up laws and they were like, "We're coming to your house. You pack it up, get on the outskirts. You can't own property. We're just gonna leave it like that for 50 years." It's almost crazy when you really think about it. I mean, it's just crazy that this happened so officially and so succinctly and just written down. And so the international community starts to take notice of this right around the 60s, specifically with the Sharpeville massacre, which was when the South African police opened fire on some unarmed black people, both the ANC and the PAC, which is an offshoot of the ANC. They killed 67 people and wounded like 180 more of unarmed people. And so that's one of the things that kind of brought it to the international stage of people being like, what are they doing over there? That doesn't seem all the way right. And so the United Nations would call for sanctions against the South African government for all the stuff that they're doing. They would kind of, agree to these small parts and different things like that. But by the 1970s, the U.S. had succeeded in pressuring their governments and actually imposing real sanctions on cities like Pretoria and other things, like other places. And we'll mention really fast, I didn't say before in the whole layout of South Africa. It actually is interesting. South Africa doesn't have a main capital of their country. Their capitals are laid out by the different parts of government. So there's the legislative branch has its own city, the judicial branch has its own city, the executive branch has its own city. I find that to be really, really interesting. I would love to know more about that. I didn't know people were doing that. But they do the sanctions, and it's really interesting to see who was against them and who wasn't. And when I did my research, I found that Reagan and Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, were actually opposed to the 1980 sanctions. And this is kind of because South Africa, and they were seen as an ally during that time in the Cold War. So they didn't want to put a lot of pressure on them. You know what I mean? But it's like when you think of it, it's just crazy when you think about the different alignments of sovereignty throughout the years that America and Britain at the time were just like, you see the wrong, you see the atrocities, but because of your political leanings and your alignments, you can't actually do anything about it. That was really sad when I saw that both of them were just like, and then you find out why. I didn't even realize, and this is a little bit off, not too much, but that South Africa now is in like a pact with like China, India, another country like Russia. Like they're in their own little thing. I think it's called BRISC, and it's like they're like developed nations, but not developed nations that are just like in cahoots with each other. I don't know. It's just weird to see how the switching goes. Like 30 years ago, y'all were on the American side of the Cold War. Now you're hanging out with Russians. Whole different podcast. I was interested to see that the Reagan and Thatcher thing. Let's see. We'll skip on past that. What I find is interesting about ending of apartheid is that it actually Nelson Mandela plays a part in it even from prison. So what we'll find is that the South African government would hold secret meetings with Mandela. And we're talking 10, 15 years before he was even released from prison. He would meet with, the president and other people and talk about what they needed to do to try to actually find peace and actually, abolish apartheid. I found that to be really, really interesting because I don't know much about this, but and it's it's one thing to say, we're going to talk about it in the next 6 months. You're going to get out. They were talking with this dude about ending apartheid 15 years before apartheid even ended, and they said it was actually one of the reasons why he was moved in prisons. He was moved to a different prison to be closer to the people that he needed to talk to about possibly getting rid of apartheid. So there was a whole secret meeting section of this ending of apartheid. I believe was it in 1989, South African Prime Minister P.W. Botha resigned after it became clear that he had lost faith in the National Party. That's the Afrikaners national movement, for failing to actually bring order to the country, which order would have been apartheid working out positively. And so his successor, a man by the name of F.W. de Klerk, when he came on the scene, he announced to Parliament in 1990 that he was lifting the ban on the ANC and other black liberation parties. And that is actually why Nelson Mandela was in prison. And it took me a long time, a lot of reading to figure that out, but now I understand. It makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense as to why he got released. Because once you stop making what he was doing illegal, you have to let him out of jail. And so that's kind of what led to him getting out of jail in February, I believe it was on February 11th, 1990. And so what happened after that is the prime minister actually agreed to have democratic elections for South Africa. And then the U.S. lifted the sanctions that they had on them, which increased the foreign aid and made them, got them more money. And basically they had the election, and Nelson Mandela became the first black president in 1994. And he did this on the African National Congress. And that is how apartheid happened. And now it's time for the roundup. And we're going to round it up. The first European contact to South Africa was the Portuguese. It was the Dutch who tried to actually colonize South Africa first. It was the Brits who actually took it over and made it a colony. Apartheid would go into law in 1948. It would be abolished in 1990. Things I didn't know before. And now I know them. Never heard of these things. What are they? Alright, so the things I didn't know before, we're just going to cover a couple famous South African people, because I only know one, and I'm not even going to mention her, because I'm going to say her, but I'm not going to talk about it too much. Charlize Theron was the only South African person I had ever heard of, probably until the last few years of my life. So she's South African. The first person to ever actually do open heart surgery, he was also South African. So this guy's name was Christian Barnard, and he was the first person to do a human-to-human heart transplant. He did so on December the 3rd, 1967. And so that must just blown people's minds. You think about it. It's something that happens all the time now, but he took, and I've always found like organ transplants to be just remarkable. I'm an organ donor, full disclosure. My father has had organs donated to him, and so I've really seen what an effect it can have on someone's life. But so for the first time to just see, they said they took it out of a accident victim who had died, a woman named Denise, and they put it in a 54-year-old guy named Lewis's heart, in his little chest cavity, and he woke up and he was able to talk with his wife. And wait a minute. But then they said this guy died 18 days later. Okay, hold on. We're getting to the bottom of this here. And this happened because of the anti-rejection meds that he was on, which is a big deal. Like I said, my father actually got a liver transplant about 7 or 8 years ago. And once you get it in, that's all good. But there's a wait period of finding out if your body will accept it. And so you have to take, and I think he actually even still now has to take anti-rejection meds, so his body just will continue to accept the new organ in his body. But this guy was not lucky enough. He died. Okay, didn't know that. The next one I wanted to talk about, because I did not truthfully think this person existed in history, and it is Shaka Zulu. I just thought it was something that was just made up because it sounds cool. Maybe he's a rapper or something. I don't know. But this guy was King Shaka of the Zulu people. So that's actually some stuff that actually happened. He was fighting not the initial European contact, but he was fighting European contact trying to take over his land. He died in the 1820s, and he reigned for about 20 or 30 years. He was born in the 1700s. So I'm reading about this guy, because I don't know much about him. So they say when his mom died, he ordered a bunch of mass executions and said people couldn't plant stuff. And then he had all the pregnant women killed and their husbands. And this was going on for a while until somebody stood up and was like, yo, bro, not cool. And evidently he was taken aback by someone just being so real with him that he was like, you know what, bro, you're right, not cool. And gave him like a bunch of cows. That's history for you, man. But so yeah, I just wanted to mention. So if you ever wonder where Shaka Zulu comes from, he's from the original South African, before it was South Africa. Is there another one? Oh, and we'll briefly cover the Blade Runner, Oscar Pistorius. He was the guy out there running on those blades, like those. He has like no feet, but he has like these blades that he puts his like limbs into, and he was really famous for a while until he killed a woman, and he's still in jail for that, I believe, right now. That was just a crazy turn of events when you think about it. You go from being one of the more famous handicapped dudes in the world to being in jail. All right, that was another episode of How Did That Happen? We learned a lot about apartheid. There is so much there, so much to unpack that I'm sure I missed some things. I'm sure I got some things wrong. I think I may have mentioned that there's a president when they actually have a prime minister of South Africa. Just a lot of different things. I mean, I'm trying to cover more dense topics. I'm trying to dive into some things that that interest me, and that I can hopefully that interest them, my listeners as well. So, definitely let me know if I missed something. That's what the mini-sode is about. We'll definitely be covering a little bit more of apartheid on the next BSB coming out in a couple days. But yeah, it was good. I hope you guys liked it. We're going to keep trying to cover larger topics. The podcast is getting more long form. We've actually just reached over 24 hours of me talking. So if you ever have nothing to do with your entire life and you want to just kill a day, you can put me on and you can hear me for 24-hour marathon of How Did That Happen in bite-sized bios, guys. Whenever it's at your fingertips. But if you love what you just heard, there's more where that came from at hdthappen.com. As always, you'll find the written version of what you just heard, as well as photos and videos that help me create the episode. There's a works cited up there as well to show you where I got all the information from. Like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps the pod grow. Give me 5 stars if you can. If not, you want to tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars and give us 2 stars. That's fine too. As always, thank you for pressing play, and we'll see you guys in a couple days with the next bite-sized bios.